Hello. Hello. Welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jenny Broadhurst. I'm the director of the Salish Sea Institute at Western Washington University. We're partnering with Western Washington University's Alumni Association to host this webinar, and I'm happy to welcome you. Today, we're going to be talking about Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project in Delta, British Columbia, and we'll talk about that and other projects in relationship to the Salish Sea. We're coming to you from Bellingham, Washington. We're situated on the ancestral homelands of the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe who have lived here since time immemorial, and we express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Our colleague Janine Bangstrom is behind the scenes. And thank you, Janine, for being here. And she's going to quickly post just a 2-question poll for you to fill out while I go over just a couple of housekeeping items. Thanks, Janine. So some of you have submitted questions during the registration process. Thanks so much for doing that. We've made note of those. The Q&A feature is live at the bottom of your screen in the middle there. And you are welcome to submit questions during the webinar. We have a lot of people on today. I'm thrilled to see so much interest. Thank you. But that also means we might not get to, we certainly won't get to all the questions. We'll do our best. Okay, let's see. Last little bit. We recommend that you use the speaker view on your Zoom and let you know that this is being recorded and will be available later. All righty. I have 2 colleagues with me here on screen, Dr. Derek Moscato and Dr. Natalie Beloy, and I'm so happy to have them joining me. Derek is a professor of journalism and public relations at Western Washington University. His area of focus is the confluence of environmental communication, global media, and persuasion. And Derek's class is actually watching this today. So hey to all of you who are in Derek's class. Natalie is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her work is informed by scholarship in critical Indigenous studies, settler colonial studies, and transdisciplinary collaboration. So thanks to both of you for being here. We are going to take turns doing short presentations, and then we're going to have a little bit of panel discussion between us. And thank you. There's the results of our poll. All right, 2/3, 77. Okay, cool. Great. And a real mix of knowledge about the proposal. So great. Thanks for doing that. That's always interesting to see who's out there and who's tracking stuff. Okay, so I'm going to start my presentation and I'm going to ask Janine to pull that up for me. Just a little bit for starters, the Salish Sea Institute teaches about the Salish Sea and all its complexity on Western Washington University's campus. We actually started a minor in Salish Sea studies. We publish and share information about the Salish Sea and its health and management challenges in an effort to increase protections of these waters. Today, we're going to talk about Roberts Bank Terminal 2, primarily because it's a big project, a mega project that will have shared impacts across the Salish Sea, and also because it's representative of the many challenges that we face in an international ecosystem with different governance structures and different treaties. Next slide. So let's start with a quick overview of an international ecosystem. The US-Canada border runs not in a straight line, and it runs through a pretty complex marine ecosystem there. As you can see, this map was made by Dr. Aquila Flower, also from Western. So the border splits the waters into separate management systems. And whether we're talking about managing Puget Sound in Washington State or managing the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia, government agencies focus on the area within their jurisdictional boundary. So generally speaking, research and monitoring projects stop their work at the border due to issues related to homeland security, as well as budget and jurisdictional restrictions. When big construction projects occur, they're reviewed by regulatory agencies, and they consider impacts within their jurisdiction, not the entire Salish Sea. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples to make this point. First, my first click here, Janine. Okay, so let's say there's a big project that's happening near Nanaimo. Imagine a large circle around that. That's the area of influence that's going to be looked at by regulatory agencies. Let's go for the next click. These little blue explosions are pretend proposed construction projects. Let's say there's one down near Everett in Snohomish County. That also would be reviewed and looked at for impacts within its sphere of influence around that region. But the last one, which is approximately where this Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is, it's not going to, we're not going to draw a circle around it. It's being reviewed for impacts in Canadian waters only. And that's kind of the premise of a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is a bit of a, I'll steal Natalie's phrase of a fictional geography that's driving a lot of review of projects. My background is largely in environmental policy. And so my part of this presentation is going to focus on some of the environmental impacts associated with a project. And let's dive in. I was intrigued at this project because it is proposed to occur literally on the international border, with impacts that would be seen on both sides of the border. I'm concerned by the environmental impacts that are anticipated from it. Next slide. The Salish Sea Institute published the State of the Salish Sea report in May of 2021. It examined the health of the entire ecosystem. There hadn't been a comprehensive report done like this since 1994. Next slide. The report looked at impacts from global climate change, regional impacts from land use, and historical impacts. And one of the summation of it is the Salish Sea is compromised by the cumulative impacts of global climate change, regional urbanization, and a growing population, and intensive human use and abuse across the ecosystem over the last 2 centuries. So that's where we're at now. And I love this view from space because it just reminds us of how connected our shared waters are here. These impacts are diminishing the health and resiliency of the Salish Sea, and we see some of our most important and valuable species, such as southern resident killer whales and Chinook salmon, listed as endangered in both the US and Canada. So again, when I saw that this proposal would have impacts to both of those species, as well as many others, I wanted to learn more. Next slide. Let's take a look at the project itself. And this verbiage is from the report itself about the project. So this is proposed by the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority to build a 3-berth marine container shipping terminal at Roberts Bank in the city of Delta. What's in the photo is what exists now. It's a coal port terminal. And so the proposal is to expand this significantly. Let's go to the next one and you'll see a diagram of it. Thank you. So what was just in the picture in the last slide is what's there in white, Roberts Bank Terminal, with its own causeway. And the proposal would be to expand the causeway significantly, and then add that brown shape to the left of what's currently there. And that's huge. That is a very, very large footprint, expanding what's already in place. Next slide. There was extensive environmental assessment of this project. This report I'm drawing from for the next several slides that was done by a review panel that was appointed by the federal government. And the next slide is another similar report that came out a little bit later, just in 2023. That's a summary assessment. Okay, next one. So here's another overview, this showing the project up in the top with the yellow, and then the shipping routes that those vessels that are coming to and fro from the terminal would take. And of course, that's an existing international shipping corridor. And the projection is that this would add something on the order of 400 plus vessels per year to the existing traffic there. Next. Okay, a little warning, I am drawing from the report, so these are, I apologize for the text, but maybe you'll see why. From that report that came from the Federal Review Panel, the summary of key findings, right on page 1. This is a good place to just find a quick overview, and I refer you to these documents for more research. But I'll draw your attention to the project would require the conversion of 177 hectares of intertidal and subtidal habitat. 177 acres is over, 177 hectares is over 400 acres for those of us who are used to that way of looking at things. That is a lot of coverage of intertidal and subtidal habitat. This gives some information specifically about where it's sited, and I'll draw your attention to the next part of this. This area near the Fraser River estuary is an ecologically productive and sensitive area of coastal British Columbia. It is located on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds and is adjacent to a provincial wildlife management area and an international Ramsar site. Some of the largest salmon runs in the world use and migrate through this area as both juveniles and adults. And this area also has critical habitat for the southern resident killer whale, which is listed as an endangered species. Next slide. In case you're not familiar with the term Ramsar site, I just pulled this from the site, but essentially that means it's part of the world's largest network of protected areas. They are wetland sites, and they tend to be used heavily for bird migratory corridors. Okay, next. Back to the report from the review panel. This shows is another way of looking at the proposed site. And again, it's in yellow down bottom there. And the hatched areas, while I know it's hard to read all of the type there, these are all various conservation areas. It's surrounded by really significant conservation areas. Next. So again, still on page 1 of that report, the panel concludes that the project would result in numerous adverse residual and cumulative effects. And it goes on with that. The last sentence, there would be significant adverse and cumulative effects on wetland and wetland functions at Roberts Bank. Habitat loss of 177 hectares. So very, very big footprint. Next. Next page of that report, and I'll just go to this highlighted section and talk about southern resident killer whales. Significant adverse and cumulative effects on southern resident killer whales through 3 different things: a loss of legally defined critical habitat, the reduction of Chinook availability, and a minor increase in underwater noise. And I want to draw your attention to that underwater noise point. I dug a little bit deeper. Let's look at the next slide on page 118 of the report. I think this is really a significant sentence. The panel accepts the information on the record that indicates that underwater noise levels in the Salish Sea are already high and are too noisy for southern resident killer whales. So the review panel itself is saying it's already too high, and yes, this project is going to make it higher. So exacerbating an impact there. Okay, next one. So there are so many species that are at risk here in the Fraser River Delta and surrounding area, and just sort of one that might not be on your radar is the barn owls that are also listed as threatened and would be impacted by an increase in vehicle traffic. Next slide. So the agencies, as I mentioned earlier, chose to look at the Canadian area to the north and southwest of the project. They were asked to do a regional assessment in the Salish Sea, and they declined. And that bottom part here that says latest update is where they say that they feel it's not warranted. And if you're interested, you can dig into this website and read the minister's response to that, but they chose not to do it. Next slide. So there were many, there were public comment periods. There were comments from all over, over 3,000 comments I saw on one website. I just wanted to highlight a couple to illustrate that there were comments coming from Washington State. EPA submitted 2 separate letters and among other things commented on the whales, Chinook, treaty rights, migratory birds. In 2020, 41 organizations asked Washington governor to oppose the project and cited concerns around oil spill risk, underwater noise, and the orcas. A very significant letter from scientists from both Washington and BC sent a letter to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change with extensive concerns and saying it's not consistent with Canada's commitment to species recovery. And a letter was published in Science magazine just this past July, stating that over 100 species at risk are already grappling with climate impacts and habitat loss, and Canada is violating its own species at risk law. No surprise, there are many lawsuits around this, and I think my colleagues are going to mention those. Next slide for me. I'm going to wrap it up here. If you're not familiar with the process, all of the regulatory hurdles have been accomplished. It was signed off by the federal government in April, and the Premier of British Columbia just signed off this end of September. As was made clear, as I've tried to make clear, there will be many impacts environmentally, permanent and irreversible. There are over 300 mitigation actions that are proposed. I didn't get into that. There is some debate about whether those are sufficient or not. Clearly, there's not a debate that the impacts will occur. Much has changed since the project was first conceived in the area of 2011. And from a climate impact standpoint, from our increasing use of alternative energy sources in terms of technology, a lot has changed. And I wonder whether those sorts of changes have been factored into this proposal. Next slide. So looking to the future, I think we need to reckon with the urgency that's associated with climate and look at mega climate action projects rather than mega project impact projects. We really can't afford business as usual. And government agencies, regulatory agencies in the US and Canada can and must address transboundary and cumulative impacts for these sorts of large projects. And with that, I am going to close mine down and either take a couple questions from my colleagues or jump into Derek's presentation.
Maybe I can just ask you one quick question to expand on that last point, Jenny.
Yeah.
I noticed on the participant list, which it's really great to see everyone, that there are several names I recognize as people from different agencies on both sides of the border. And I wondered if you could just expand a little bit on what you see as people like working in environmental agencies in particular or other government agencies, what their role is in kind of considering these transboundary issues or what might be possible if they did.
Oh, if they were to include, if they were to look across the border, in fact, yeah, I think it's a matter of doing jobs differently and reckoning with where we're at, what our needs are. I think from an ecological perspective, that's not difficult. I think we have a lot of good relationships across the border. We have data, and we have very similar laws. So I don't think that's too much of a stretch to ask for agencies to do that. From my perspective, I'm not sitting in their shoes, so it's easier to say that from here.
And
go ahead,
Jenny, I'd like to follow up with a quick question about intergovernmental dialogue or stakeholder dialogue. What is an appropriate or potential mechanism for having these kind of transboundary policy discussions so that countries and other stakeholders can come together to sort of navigate these complex infrastructure projects?
Yeah, we're friendly governments, and we have agreements between British Columbia and Washington and US and Canada. We don't really have a formal we don't have a formal structure for bringing projects together at this level, and I'd say many have been saying for years that that's what we're missing. There was 1992, there was an environmental cooperation agreement signed between BC Premier Mike Harcourt and Washington Governor Booth Gardner. It really set the stage for a high level of collaboration, but those efforts have waned in recent years. And I think there needs to be a fresh look at how we look at these kinds of things together.
I know we're going to move to Derek, but just a quick comment, Ginny, maybe you can take a look while he and I are talking in the next little while at the questions in the chat. And as you mentioned, we may not get to all of them, but there are a couple of good ones coming in.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ginny, and I'll pick it up from here. As the title indicates, the focus of my presentation, and indeed my recent and to be published report for the Salish Sea Institute, is really focused on the public positioning and sort of media framing of the larger Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion project. And I really wanted to launch into this discussion with this particular image, which shows the Salish Sea orcas juxtaposed against the existing Roberts Bank port infrastructure. And it's a reminder that the ecology that we're talking about really exists immediately and adjacent to the port. And so that's why this is a really sort of complex issue, but it's also an indicator of the way that the media has positioned this particular project as one of either ecology, conservation, wilderness protection, and more pertaining to the way the story is positioned in Canada about sort of the future of Canada's economy and also the future of Canadian trade. And so I'll start talking about that narrative, the economy trade narrative, if you will, for Canada. And this has really comprised many of the stories and much of the reporting, over the last several years as it pertains to this particular proposal. And so I'll start by highlighting, first of all, that Canada's federal government and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority have really made a longstanding case for this expansion to sort of improve upon, existing economic legacies and impacts. It will also foster trade with over 170 existing trade partners / countries. And I should also mention that it's for the Canadian government, it's an extension of the Canada's Asia Pacific Gateways and Corridor strategy, which really links the country to the long-running Asia Pacific trade approach. And so it really sort of gives the ability of the Canadian government to handle and to sort of offer, the West Coast ports the ability to handle what amounts to 1/3 of Canada's trade outside of North America, and through the port over US $200 billion of trade. So that's a substantial economic impact. I should mention that in 2022, the last number that we have for total cargo movement, we saw over 140 million metric tons of goods flowing through the port. That was a bit down from years previous. That's owing in part to the pandemic. But what we are seeing is a long-term growth pattern for the Port of Vancouver and indeed sort of ports in North America, more generally speaking. I should also note that the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is immersed in a long-term competition with other major West Coast and global ports, many of which are also in long-term capacity growth mode. And that's reflected in a lot of the top 10 sort of ports by cargo movement rankings that you often see in industry and business publications. And so while that's been one of the large narratives in the mainstream and other forms of media, there's also a regional ecology counter narrative that's been at play. We're seeing that regional and national media in both countries have emphasized, short-range environmental impacts, but also long-term impacts for the Salish Sea watershed. An ongoing focus, of course, has been the threat to the southern resident killer whales, but also to juvenile Chinook salmon. And another story that we're starting to see quite a bit of is about the threat to migratory birds, and of course, their existence on the Pacific Flyway. And the expansion project sits right in the middle of the Pacific Flyway, as you might know. A regular point of public outreach and media focus in recent stories has been the issuance of 370 conditions for mitigation by the Canadian government. Many of these conditions focus on marine mammal and fish habitats. And that brings me to the final point on this slide, is that this marine area, which surrounds the next phase of port development, represents a really prominent habitat for orcas and salmon, but it's also, or I should say, it also takes on a social cultural dimension, representing prominent tribal, commercial, and recreational fishing grounds. There is a legal challenge ongoing to this project, and it comes from an environmental alliance consisting of the David Suzuki Foundation, the Georgia Strait Alliance, the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation, and the Wilderness Committee in British Columbia. And these organizations have been represented by EcoJustice on the legal grounds that the project runs contrary to Canada's Species at Risk Act. And another layer to this, of course, is the serious concerns from First Nations and tribal communities on both sides of the border. And those have gained a growing attention in some of this cross-border media coverage, particularly the Lummi Nation's views. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I wanted to show you the extent to which this project is truly a transboundary project. You can see that where I have the letters or the letters and numbers RBT2. That is the site of essentially the second island that will sit beside the existing Roberts Bank project. And it's literally within a kilometer of the US-Canada boundary, but also very proximate to Point Roberts in Whatcom County, USA, also coastal Whatcom County, but indeed to a number of different sort of communities and ecologies on both sides of the US-Canada border, the Fraser Valley, Metropolitan Vancouver, the Gulf Islands, the San Juan Islands, Vancouver Island, and more. And this really brings me to the transboundary story. We've seen significant concerns by tribal nations on both sides of the border. But more recently, we've seen the Lummi Nation on the US side gain national media coverage for their concerns about the project. However, localized concerns such as immediate community impacts, industrial air pollution, increased vessel traffic, truck traffic, rail congestion, the underwater noise that can harm orcas, those particular angles have not received as much attention from the national news media. Local community publications and science publications have done more work, however, in that area. But I think one of the main takeaways from all of this is that the media coverage leads to not only sort of flows of information, but also potential attitudinal shifts. Part of the role of these stories, as far as many of the organizations involved, is to win over hearts and minds. And so the construction of stories about the project relies not only on journalists, but also this larger information ecosystem that includes communication specialists, industry leaders, environmental advocates, community organizations, and the presence or lack thereof of these entities helps to dictate how the port expansion story is framed or positioned for public attention or public sentiment. And so this is just a snapshot from the past spring and summer, the stories that have been published in regional and national media publications. One thing you'll notice if you look to the right column on thematic focus is that many of these stories have been sort of predicated on either economic, environmental, or regulatory themes. And so we're seeing many of the same themes sort of reoccur in this coverage. And so there are challenges to this type of journalism work. One of the big challenges is that a project like Roberts Bank and its expansion exists over not the course of months or even years, but literally decades. And so finding journalistic outlets that can sort of track that growth, not only in sort of an immediate time frame, but long term, becomes really important. Another challenge is that news values like immediacy, impact, and conflict that kind of drive newsroom activity tend to make things like government press releases and organizational announcements more salient, but they tend to overshadow the long-term ecological and community impacts that could warrant more coverage. Another key missing piece to all of this is in the aggregate, and for the most part, the US national media. Most of the stories here have attracted attention from north of the border or in the regional media, but for policymakers south of the border to take notice, you need more traction in US national media. And the flip side of that is that RBT2, or the Roberts Bank expansion, has been identified as mostly a Canadian story versus a truly transboundary story. And finally, an important dimension to all of this is this notion of transboundary advocacy. And the question is, can issues related to climate, wildlife habitat, and pollution garner more transboundary cooperation among advocates, scientists, activists, policymakers, and more, like we have seen in other watersheds in Cascadia and the Salish Sea region? And so just one example of really compelling reporting was done in 2021 by the New York Times, where it was really a combination of reporting, photo essay, opinion, multimedia, and educational. And I think that may be a model that more media outlets can latch onto if they, of course, have the right resources in play. And so that brings me to my final takeaway, which is that we need to do a better job of reinvesting in our newsrooms generally, and specifically for beats like the environment and the economy. But we also need to reconnect local, community, and tribal issues to national policy coverage on both sides of the border, really get back to this idea of genuine and authentic transboundary coverage. We also need to do more sustained coverage of long-term mega projects like the port, and not be so worried about things like news pegs or press releases or government announcements. And this would also apply to other mega infrastructure projects like airports and refineries, and the list goes on. And finally, I think we can rethink the production of journalism when it comes to these very complex, multi-layered stories, so that they can better represent the multiplicity of stakeholders that are involved from all of these different jurisdictions. I'll leave it there, and please feel free to reach out if you have comments or questions about this presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Natalie, unless there are questions from either of you.
Well, I have a question for you, which is, I know you've also examined transboundary coverage in relation to like the Skagit donut hole controversy and Keystone Pipeline. And I'm curious if you could just offer a comment comparing kind of this case, this particular example, to some of those other recent examples.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think that the case of the Skagit watershed and the donut hole gold mining development that was occurring just north of the border was really sort of a model of how cross-border, advocacy cooperation can work. And that really, it does involve, to an extent, sort of formalizing an alliance with various organizations sort of taking on their respective roles. But it does work, and it is a great way to not only sort of generate that kind of sort of cross-border advocacy, but it also is presents a forum for cross-border dialogue between the US and Canadian and tribal and Washington State and British Columbia publics. That is so important, so that we reach sort of the right decisions on these kind of sort of long-range environmental economic projects.
Thanks.
Derek, I feel like sometimes I just want to say that it feels like people in the States just don't really care about what's going on in Canada, and that therefore journalists think it's not news if it's happening in Canada. And yet, obviously we share, in this case, we're sharing a whole water system, a whole ecosystem. How do we get journalists to care or to think, to make that of interest to us? That's not a very fair question to ask you, but it's top of mind.
Well, like I said, one of the takeaways here is that this particular project exists in that news shadow, where it literally exists in this transboundary Canada-US region, and yet it's easy to miss for reporters, particularly on the national level, because it looks like a Canadian only story. I think actually the Canadian journalism industry has done a pretty good job of giving this story a lot of coverage in sort of the economic and environmental aspects, but it has not received near the amount of coverage that it probably deserves in the US national media. And it goes back to that news shadow effect that's in play in this part of the world, that is the Salish Sea.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's let Natalie go, and then I think we all have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try to tackle some in the QA, but I'm trying to listen and write at the same time. It's not working.
Yeah, I know. I think that's hard. I've got a few kind of running thoughts that we can get to towards the end. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Maybe just want to make sure that you can see the right part. Here we go. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, cool. All right. Okay, let me just get organized here. Working on a smaller screen than usual, so apologies. All right. Well, hi all. I'm originally from the US Midwest, and I've lived in the Salish Sea region for most of my adult life on both sides of the Canada-US border and on the territories of several Coast Salish nations. And my research focuses on non-Indigenous peoples like myself and our responsibilities while living on Indigenous lands and waters. And a key feature of this work involves examining settler colonial systems that are still at play in our region. So my hope and contribution today is to put Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project in the context of settler colonialism on the multinational Salish Sea, not to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples, but rather to call attention to power dynamics at play in our region. And I want to just clarify that I say multinational to add to Derek's use of transboundary, because it's not just the US and Canada here. There are over 80 Indigenous nations that call the Salish Sea their home. So I'll sometimes use that terminology, multinational Salish Sea, to kind of remind us all of that point. I'm going to get into just a little bit of definition stuff so that you know what I mean when I say settler colonialism. Settler colonialism isn't an event that's over. It's rather a structure that persists and endures. And anthropologist Patrick Wolf and critical Indigenous studies scholar Kawanui, explain that settlers come to stay and Indigenous peoples endure. Settlers map over Indigenous territories and laws, but it's an incomplete process all the time because Indigenous people persist. And so that's what we see today on the Salish Sea. It's a settler-dominant set of systems on both sides of the border, with multiple Indigenous nations enduring, resisting, and refusing these systems as they maintain and assert their Indigenous sovereignty. Like Derek, I also aim to publish an emerging issues piece, and I'm co-writing that with my wonderful graduate student, Bella Pip. And we welcome your thoughts in the chat box. We'll look at them. Even if we don't get to all the questions, we'll be considering them as we finalize our draft. And many thanks to Bella for all her work on the project. I also want to thank my faculty and community colleagues, because this presentation draws heavily on my teaching with them over the last several years in Salish Sea Studies classes and anthropology courses. And in those classes, my co-instructors and I teach about the bioregional Salish Sea using this wonderful map and Aquila's maps. And we try to get into the dynamic ecological complexity of the region, while also looking at political complexity by addressing the fact that there are many Indigenous nations who've lived here for thousands of years before the border was drawn, and the ways that their territories have been changed by settler colonialism and industrialization, through the movement of many, many people, thousands of people, millions of people onto their lands. And the ways that this waterscape has been carved up through different kinds of treaty agreements with the federal governments of the US and Canada. And you can clearly see on this map, which is taken from nativeland.ca, the border, because it's shaded in where the Treaty of Point Elliott is, right in the center of the map, whereas most of BC is not shaded in because there weren't historical treaties with most nations across that province. So today I'm going to talk through a couple of lessons that I've developed to kind of get into these complexities with my students, with Roberts Bank being one of them. The other two are the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project and the Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal. I know there are people calling in from both sides of the border and with different kinds of understandings of these different projects. So some of this might be review and some of this might be new. And so feel free to ask for clarification as I go. For US listeners, I want you just to note that these three projects are closer in proximity to one another than Bellingham is to Seattle. And for Canadian listeners, the proximity is similar to the distance between West Van and White Rock. And yet, as Derek noted, the border has created some ways in which these stories don't travel in that same amount of distance. So I'm going to try to show you the ways that the T2 expansion initiative can't really be understood fully if we don't address settler colonialism, indigenous sovereignty, and environmental assessment as a limited case-by-case regulatory system. So let's start with Trans Mountain. So the extraction and export of oil from Western Canada began in the 1940s, and within a decade after that, oil began flowing through the Trans Mountain pipeline from the tar sands of Alberta to Salish Sea ports. Am I covering you all? There we go. And so we see the Salish Sea ports here when we look closer at the close-up, and we can also see the refineries down here in Washington that get oil through the Puget Sound spur of the Trans Mountain pipeline. In 2012, Kinder Morgan was the US-based company that owned the pipeline at the time, and they announced a proposal to twin the pipeline and triple oil transport capacity, applying to Canada's National Energy Board to review and approve the project. Opposition emerged immediately, and it's continued since, focusing on concerns about environmental impacts and infringement on Indigenous rights, amongst other concerns. And in my classes, I focus specifically on the Tsleil-Waututh Nation's opposition to the expansion and their efforts to work in coalition with other nations and environmental groups to halt the project. So students read excerpts of the assessment from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, which they issued in 2015. And this opens opportunities to emphasize that Indigenous nations have their own legal frameworks, but they often have to fight for recognition of their rights through colonial legal frameworks. And as a lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law once explained to me, there's Indigenous law and Aboriginal law in Canada. And by that, they meant that Indigenous law is an umbrella term for the legal systems of Indigenous nations embedded in their cultures and languages, while Aboriginal law is an umbrella term for the interface between Canadian legal systems and Indigenous nations, including Canadian Supreme Court cases that have affirmed Indigenous rights, such as the Sparrow, Garin, and Haida versus BC cases, which are all really important in BC, especially where, as I mentioned, there are few historical treaties negotiated with First Nations. That means most of the province is unceded land, and land issues continue to play out in real time. The 2004 Haida versus BC case is especially relevant today because it affirmed that Indigenous nations must be consulted regarding Crown projects on First Nations territories. So the Tsleil-Waututh Nation's assessment examined the Trans Mountain Expansion Project from the angle of Indigenous law, specifically their own laws in Tsleil-Waututh Nation, ultimately recommending that the Chief and Council continue to uphold Tsleil-Waututh Nation's support for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. And that's what they've done. Their Chief and Council have abided by this recommendation, formalizing their withholding of support on the Aboriginal law side of things, meaning in the Canadian law context, through filings in the federal court system in Canada. They joined with the Squamish Nation and other nations, as well as Ecojustice, Raincoast, and others that Derek mentioned, to argue that the National Energy Board's initial 2016 approval of the pipeline was fundamentally flawed due to inadequate consultation and environmental review. And in 2018, the same day that Kinder Morgan's shareholders approved the sale of the pipeline to the Government of Canada, the Federal Court of Appeal sided with Tsleil-Waututh and its coalition, agreeing that there had not been sufficient consultation with Indigenous groups. And so a new round of consultation ensued, with the National Energy Board panel hearing testimony from over 100 nations along the pipeline route in Canada over 3 weeks in late 2018 and early 2019. By the summer of 2019, the National Energy Board and the federal government once again approved the project, stating that their duty to consult had been satisfied, that the project was in the national interest, and that the benefits outweighed the risks. Tsleil-Waututh and its coalition again appealed to the federal courts that consultation still was not sufficient, but the Supreme Court ultimately declined to hear their appeal. So construction continues in fits and starts due to stoppages of many kinds, and the project is years behind schedule and tens of billions of dollars over budget. The pipeline is aiming to be operational in the next few months, and next year vessel traffic may increase by over 400 oil tankers navigating through the Salish Sea. I think that's a conservative estimate at this point. So keep that number in mind when we talk also about Roberts Bank increase in vessel traffic, because that's also related to the cumulative effects that we're trying to point to too. All right, so next I'll turn to, this is a piece that I show my students to show them the transit of oil tankers through the Salish Sea, and I think a good example of journalism about cross-border issues. All right, so let's go to Gateway Pacific next. So at the same time as the Trans Mountain debates have been unfolding, another fossil fuel transport initiative emerged on the US side of the border. In 2011, SSA Marine proposed to build a coal export terminal at Cherry Point, Washington, a site known to Lummi people as Wichiakan. The proponents chose to place the Gateway Pacific Terminal, or GPT, at Cherry Point because it offered a deep water port to connect railways and marine vessel transport, particularly to ship coal from Wyoming and Montana to China. When my colleagues and I teach about Gateway Pacific, most of our students haven't heard about it, even though 10 years ago, public opposition to GPT was immediate and no coal train signs can still be seen around town today. We give students materials to assess the project, including the Lummi Nation scoping comments, and they work in groups to decide whether they think the project should move forward and whether they think it ultimately did or not. And over the years, students have almost unanimously voted that they don't think the project should proceed, but they all think that it did anyway. So that says something about the current generation and what their thinking is around decision-making in relation to climate issues. But in fact, in this case, as some of you on the call know, they were wrong. This expansion didn't happen. And that's because the Lummi Nation, working in coalition with environmental advocacy groups, effectively leveraged their treaty rights to stop the project. In 2015, they sent a formal request to the Army Corps of Engineers, the government entity in charge of granting the permit for GPT, arguing that the project posed more than de minimis impact to their rights to fish. And these are rights protected by the US Treaty of Point Elliott and affirmed through the US Bolt decision in 1974. And in May 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers agreed with their assessment and denied the permit, ultimately squashing the GPT project. So students are often surprised by this outcome, and it opens opportunities for important lessons about Indigenous sovereignty, treaty law, and more. Another discussion opens up when I ask, well, if Lummi stopped the coal terminal, where are all those coal trains going when they go through town? So that's what gets us back to Roberts Bank. This is where the coal trains go, to West Shore Terminals, the only coal export terminal in the Pacific Northwest. This is a photo version of what Ginny showed you earlier. This summer, I took my Borderlands class to Brunswick Point, which is just kind of over here on the water, right by the mouth of the South Fork of the Fraser. And we also traveled a few kilometers south to Point Roberts. And while we were at Brunswick Point, we stood at the mouth here at the heart of the Salish Sea. We could see Mount Baker across the farm fields and the recognizable shape of Orcas Island above the port equipment of Roberts Bank. And we could see ferries, tankers, and cargo ships passing right offshore as well. And when we visited Monument Park at Point Roberts, just on the other side of the border, we could see BC ferries backing up across the US Marine border to exit the ferry landing, and also coal dust on the balconies of condos from the West Shore Marine terminals at Roberts Bank. That day, we also drove through Tsawwassen Nation, one of the few First Nations to sign a modern treaty in recent years. And these lands and waters around us are important to numerous other nations too, including the Lummi. Both Roberts Bank and Point Roberts have numerous other place names in different Coast Salish dialects. The English name Roberts comes from Captain George Vancouver, one of the first white men to visit this region in the late 1700s, who named Point Roberts after his friend, Captain Henry Roberts. And I've been teaching about Roberts Bank for the past 4 years, much of that time awaiting official word from the Canadian government about whether the proposed T2 project would be approved or not. The environmental review panel, as we've discussed, submitted their report, including Indigenous consultation in 2020. Draft conditions were issued in 2021. And in April of this year, as we've heard, the Minister in Environment of Climate Change Canada informed the Governor and Council that duties to consult Indigenous nations had been satisfied and that the review panel had identified significant adverse environmental effects. The Governor and Council decided these adverse effects were justified and approved the project with over 300 conditional amendments, including agreements with some Indigenous nations. Last week, the province of BC also approved the project. Meanwhile, the Lummi Nation and other US tribes have been paying close attention. In May this year, the Lummi Nation filed for judicial review to challenge the Government of Canada for failing in their duty to consult Indigenous nations about projects pertaining to their territories. The 600+ page review panel report that Ginny drew from earlier did address concerns and critiques about the project from Lummi and other US tribes and US agencies like the Washington State Department of Ecology, but the decision statement did not. Instead, the decision statement identified 48 individual nations, 18 of which are part of alliances, in their decision. Well, none of the US tribes were named, named in the environmental review were mentioned in the decision statement, nor were any transboundary issues. There isn't a map showing these 48 nations, but this map here showing spill response offers a glimpse into how the waterscape was carved up into those 3 affected areas. And as you can see, while the scoping region includes lands and waters stretched all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, the Lummi Nation's usual and accustomed fishing grounds right here, just off Point Roberts, less than a mile away, and the US San Juans and other parts of the US of the Salish Sea did not. As those of us who work in transboundary multinational Salish Sea context know, it's not uncommon to see maps like this, where this waterscape is carved up in these ways. And one reason I use this particular case study with my students is to ask them to really critically examine how geopolitical imaginaries correspond with environmental care of the Salish Sea. The Lummi Nation's legal challenge will challenge these geopolitical impositions of the border. They build on the legal precedent established in the 2021 Supreme Court of Canada case, Queen versus Des Hôtels, which interpreted the definition Aboriginal peoples of Canada to include contemporary descendants of people who occupied Canadian territories at the time of European contact. By interpreting and expanding this definition, groups whose members are neither citizens or residents of Canada can claim Aboriginal rights under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. Case law on the duty to consult Indigenous nations falls under Section 35, and the Lummi Nation will argue that the Crown failed in its duty to consult them as people with historical claims to lands, waters, and resources within the scoping area of the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 Expansion Initiative. So these stories, to wrap up here, convey how resource extraction industries, including fossil fuel, have been and continue to be a force of environmental change and economic expression of settler colonialism across the Salish Sea. And the future of our region depends in a large part on how industrial expansion projects like these will continue or halt, depending on how legal obligations to Indigenous nations are maintained, upheld, denied, or negotiated. The Roberts Bank case will be especially interesting to watch from a legal perspective because it is potentially precedent setting in ways that could transform the future of the Salish Sea. And as my colleague on this project, Bella, noted, there are cumulative impacts to the environment from these projects. And likewise, there are cumulative impacts through case law and precedent-setting court cases like Bolt on the US side, the Haida case on the Canadian side, and the Des Hôtels case that spans the border. Meanwhile, economic proponents, like Derek mentioned, suggest that these mega projects will continue to have cumulative economic impacts in the region and beyond. So my question is how we'll weigh these combined cumulative effects instead of ignoring them or playing kind of a project by project whack-a-mole through the environmental regulatory system. And this is a question that Lummi, Tsleil-Waututh, and other Indigenous nations have been asking for decades.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie.
Do you have any questions?
I
know I went over my time for.
I do. No, it's okay. I have a couple things top of mind. One is that Linda Mapes is on, and she shared with me an amazing photo. That I don't want to change the subject here. This is related, but I'll do this. And this is Tahlequah carrying her dead baby around just right in front of this Roberts Bank current terminal, which, as she says it all. I wanted to go to a question that came in through registration, maybe because it helps boil things down a little bit. A teacher asked, what should middle school students be learning who are learning about Washington state history know about the complexity of these issues in the Salish Sea? And Natalie, to your frame here, is there sort of a boiled down point that you would say to a middle school teacher?
I would argue to start teaching Washington state history way before the 1880s, because it could help students to put into context this very recent human time frame. And I often talk to my students about how the border has only existed for 1% to 2% of human history in this region. And so I think by expanding that timeline, it can open up a lot of conversations to kind of think beyond borders and the way that they shape how we even understand ourselves in this place in Washington.
Yeah. And I would add the maps that we use say so much, because when we use maps that only have political borders, oftentimes we're just ignoring things so much, think of those maps that show Canada as just a gray area, or vice versa, show the US as a gray area. I don't want to monopolize questions, but I'm also kind of thinking about, you brought up the coal that's coming through Washington State, right through Bellingham, and that's going to that existing coal terminal. And some have said, if Canada stopped transporting that coal from the existing terminal, there would be space for what they want to do with Roberts Bank Terminal too. So I just want to make note of that, because that's doing things differently, thinking about possibilities and alternatives that aren't necessarily obvious, but thinking outside the normal box and thinking about how things are changing. I read that 40% of global shipping currently is fossil fuel related. And as we are reducing our use of fossil fuels, it puts a whole different dynamic to think how we're thinking about the future and how much need there is. I know that the proposal is not for fossil fuel, but just looking at the opportunities to take away some of it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that some of the kind of economic modeling that some of these projects are based on. I mean, these proposals have been years in the works, right? And so they're based on particular ideas of what might happen with different markets. And we see with the Russian-Ukraine example, for example, that's really shifted kind of demand on oil, or how global markets work in relation to oil. And so I think that being able to be conscientious of those things in even the economic modeling side, and thinking about climate change, which is accelerating faster than some of those models anticipated, environmental models too. I think that those things combined could really help to make more informed decisions, especially when saying things are in the national interest, for example. What does that look like in a short term and long term when we really consider those different time spans? I also wanted to quickly note, I saw something in the comment, I think you already answered it, Ginny, but someone was asking about population growth and global human population growth. And I just want to note that from like a cultural anthropology perspective and like critical analysis of power, not all humans have the same impact on the environment, and not all human like actions or systems of economies, et cetera, have the same impact on environments. And so I think that it's important that we get more specific than human population growth and really consider like, what are the systems that we're employing as we grow as a global population? Because we don't necessarily need to be shipping the quantities that we are in order to meet basic needs. And we can see that because there are people around the world who don't have their basic needs met in this particular setup.
Natalie, I was hoping to ask a quick question about going back to the classroom and what you do with your students. And I think it's great that you actually bring your students to these places and really sort of engage in a material way with this issue. What do you recommend to our audience today and people who are invested in this issue, regardless of their perspective of it? How can they sort of engage with this development in a meaningful way, very much like the way your students are doing currently?
Yeah, thanks for that question. One of the things that my colleagues and I have talked about with our students is building a practice of paying attention and to the places where we live, not as like a backdrop to our lives, but rather something that we're actively engaging with. And so one very basic thing that I do is I suggest students subscribe to Salish Sea news and blog spot from Salish Sea Current or Salish Current, because it gives like a daily snapshot of what's going on in transboundary issues related to the environment. It helps me to pay close attention and to be able to know when there are public comment periods, for example, or when a new report comes out about adverse effects on the environment related to different projects. So building a habit, building a practice of where we live being an active part of who we are, and paying attention to the stories that can come out and do come out from people who are doing that transboundary coverage.
Thanks for that.
Wow, this is great. We've had 150 people on the webinar today. Clearly, there's a ton of interest. Both Derek and Natalie are working on white papers that the Salish Sea Institute will be publishing. Derek should be out soon, so keep track of that. Sign up for our newsletter if you want to know when that happens. I also wanted to say, last licks, environmental actions have economic consequences too, and we need to do a better job of tracking the cost of those environmental impacts, because that is huge. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you. Thanks, Natalie and Derek, for your work, and Janine behind the scenes. Thanks for your support. We'll see you next time.